Tenjin is the patron deity of learning in Japan, and with over 10,000 shrines dedicated to him, he is one of the country's most popular gods. In particular, he is worshipped to gain academic success, and his shrines are often visited by students before important entrance exams. But this wasn't always the case. His name, which means the heavenly god, hints that he once had quite different attributes, and if we go back to the very beginning, he wasn't a god at all. In life, he was known as Sugawara no Michizane, and he's remembered as one of the greatest poets in Japanese history. Born in 845, he descended from a distinguished family of scholars. His grandfather, Sugawara no Kiyotomo, had served as director of the National Academy, a position roughly equivalent to Minister of Education. His father, Sugawara no Koroyoshi, was considered the foremost scholar of his day, and apart from holding various administrative positions, he also served as tutor to no less than 2 emperors, in addition to running a private school in his mansion. Michizane was one of the youths taught by him, and thanks to this, he managed to pass the entrance examination for the National Academy. Having graduated, he began his career as a fairly minor official in the court bureaucracy in 870. Over the following decade, he slowly climbed the administrative ladder, gaining more and more desirable positions. His training and skill in classical Chinese also provided him with many opportunities to draft edicts and correspondences for court officials. Records show that he composed petitions to the emperor and took part in receiving foreign delegations. In addition to his positions at court, he eventually took over his father's school and was appointed Monjo Hakase, the highest professional office achievable at the National Academy. In this position, he was charged with teaching Chinese literature, but in the beginning of the century, it had been raised in importance to also serve as a kind of special secretary to the emperor. In 886, Michizane was appointed governor of Sanuki province, located on the island of Shikoku. This was not a great move for his career, as he was now effectively relegated away from the power and influence of the capital. However, his dismay at a provincial appointment ought to have been somewhat ameliorated by the fact that Sanuki was not an undesirable province. It was fairly advanced both economically and culturally, and at a roughly 6-day journey distance from the capital of Kyoto, it wasn't particularly remote. During his 4-year tenure as governor, Michizane got time to indulge in his great passion for literature. He assisted in the compilation of 2 works on Japanese history and made collections of his father's and grandfather's works. In particular, this period is noteworthy as the time when he truly came into his own as a poet. Michizane had shown talent for poetry from a very early age, but in this short period of time he produced more than a quarter of all of his poetry that is still preserved. Although he did write to some extent in Japanese, his primary interest was kanji, or Chinese poetry, an art that he had mastered to such an extent that he was said to rival the Chinese themselves. However, as governor, he also had some duties to attend to. Based on the limited records that survive, he was for example expected to tour the province, recommending outstanding individuals to the court, and if need be, handing out punishment. Furthermore, we hear that a severe drought in 887 forced him to petition the Buddhas and the Shinto kami to help relieve it. All in all, the sources indicate that his time as governor was only moderately successful. After his return to the capital in 890, Michizane's career would quickly pick up pace again, the reason being a power struggle between the imperial family and the mighty Fujiwara clan. The courtier Fujiwara no Mototsune had previously served as Sessho or regent, a title practically monopolized by his family. However, he then went on to invent the title of Kampaku, which allowed him to retain the powers of a regent even after the emperor had come of age. Thereby, he had managed to permanently take control over the government. Emperor Uda, who had been enthroned during Michizane's 4-year absence, was determined to take back power. Initially, he had tried to equate Kampaku with Akko, a purely ceremonial title without any official duties, but the experts brought in to assure that this was indeed the case didn't dare to go against the Fujiwara, and so the attempt was thwarted. Another chance would appear just a few years later, as Mototsune passed away in 891. Uda took this opportunity to get rid of the late Kampaku's supporters, appointing many of them as governors of distant provinces. Furthermore, he began giving prominent government positions to non-Fujiwara officials, and foremost of them was Sugawara no Michizane. He fitted in well with the emperor's Confucian philosophy that men of ability, and in particular scholarly ability, should run the state, and now went on to receive a rapid series of promotions. One of the many positions offered him was that of ambassador to China. Ever since the early 7th century, Japan had continually been sending missions there to study things like the Chinese system of government, medicine, art, or Buddhism. But Michizane never went on his mission, which was scheduled for the year 894. Instead, he came out in favor of abolishing the imperial embassies, supposedly because of the decline of the Tang dynasty. His reasoning persuaded the emperor to put an end to the practice, and just a few years later, the Tang dynasty collapsed. In 897, Uda's reign came to an end as he abdicated in favor of his eldest son, later known as Emperor Daigo. Under this new sovereign, Michizane continued to be favored, and 2 years later he reached the peak of his power by being appointed Minister of the Right, the second highest office at court. But his close relationship with the imperial family would ultimately be used against him. One of Michizane's daughters had been married to a son of Emperor Uda called Tokyo, and in 901 he was falsely accused of plotting to depose Daigo in favor of this prince. The accusation was made by his main rival, Fujiwara no Tokihira, and it convinced Daigo to have Michizane demoted to a minor administrative post at Dazaifu on the island of Kyushu. Hearing this, the former Emperor Uda, now a Buddhist monk, left his temple to try to mediate the situation, but was denied an audience with his son. Thus, Michizane, along with 4 of his children, were forced to leave the capital. Shortly before departing, he wrote what is likely his most famous poem, dedicated to his favorite plum tree, which he would never get to see again. Quote, "When the east wind blows, flourish in full bloom, you plum blossoms. Even though you lose your master, don't be oblivious to spring." His new home in Dazaifu was a simple, ramshackle building, and he was barely provided with enough food to feed himself and his family. Possibly because of these poor conditions, one of his young sons soon passed away. Then, in 903, just 2 years after his arrival, Michizane himself died, leaving behind a series of poems bemoaning his fate and protesting his innocence. Soon afterwards, a series of misfortunes befell the court in Kyoto. First of all, the city was struck with plague and fierce thunderstorms, followed by the untimely deaths of a number of aristocrats. This led people to wonder whether recent events weren't the work of Michizane's vengeful spirit. Suspicions grew even stronger when in 909, Fujiwara no Tokihira, the man who had caused Michizane's banishment, passed away aged just 39. Furthermore, Crown Prince Yasuakira met his end in 923 when he was still in his early 20s. By this point, Emperor Daigo had begun to fear Michizane's spirit and decided to try and placate it. He therefore posthumously restored him to the position of Minister of the Right and had all mentions of his banishment ceremoniously burned. But the disasters didn't end. Members of the royal family and aristocracy continued to meet an early end, and in 930 the great audience hall of the imperial palace was struck by lightning during a court council meeting. Many of those in attendance were killed, among them a number of people involved in Michizane's demotion. Additionally, Emperor Daigo, who witnessed the incident, fell ill and died a few months later. Clearly, Michizane's spirit had not been appeased yet, and something had to be done to stop it. Following the lightning incident, he'd come to be associated with the god of thunder, who was enshrined in the Kitano district of Kyoto. The imperial court therefore built the shrine of Kitano Temmangu here, hoping that it would calm the spirit. In addition to this, Michizane was officially deified in 987 and given the title of Tenjin, the heavenly god. Another shrine was built at Dazaifu, where he had passed away. It is said that when Michizane's body was taken to be buried, the bull that dragged his funeral cart suddenly stopped and refused to move any further. He was therefore buried nearby, and later the shrine of Dazaifu Temmangu was established on the same spot. Because of Michizane's great fondness for plum trees, over 6,000 of them can now be found here, and one in particular has become famous. Known as the Tobiyume, or flying plum tree, it's supposedly the same tree mentioned in Michizane's poem. One tradition states that as he left in exile, he yearned so much for it that the tree uprooted itself from the old residence in Kyoto and flew to Dazaifu. Alternatively, a more believable story says that it's a seedling transplanted either by Michizane or by a friend of his. For over 100 years after his death, any major disasters were feared as the curse of Michizane, and as a result, worship of Tenjin spread across the country from the initial 2 shrines. As time passed, however, memories of the original disasters faded, and he came to be seen more as a god of literature. His association with academics was further strengthened in the Edo period, when shrines dedicated to him were often built in connection to new schools. Nowadays, he is the 4th most worshipped god in Japan, and the grounds of his over 10,000 shrines are often decorated with statues of sitting bulls and planted with his beloved plum trees.